to me, one of the biggest differences between 1977 and now is now I don't have to take somebody's word for something. I can go design the experiment myself and run the experiment myself without even leaving the building.
Welcome to the Enterprise Intelligence Podcast with CEO of Shiny Docs, Jason Cassidy, and VP Customer Success, Davey Slimmon. Gentlemen, how are you this week?
Very good, Steve. Thanks for hosting us again this week. Davey, how's things in sunny Ottawa right now?
Actually sunny for the first time in quite a while. I think all of January was gray. I don't think we were alone in that, but we actually have sunshine and something resembling a blue sky today, so that's not bad.
Yeah, it certainly will take it. And and want to put a positive spin on the data associated with what we talk about and collect today. I was on a call this morning with our publicist, and we went through and we're talking about artificial intelligence and modeling in a particular industry. And quite often when we're having these conversations, as we ideate, and we're talking for an hour, which is supposed to be then collapsed into an article that you can read in a minute or two, things generally start political. It's like, what's the difference between the politics of the content and what the underlying data tends to neither be conservative nor progressive. It tends to just show something that's happening. And so we walk through a number of things, like talking about ESG scores and, of course, specifically hitting climate, specifically hitting diversity, equity, and inclusion. And in one of the areas that we kept bouncing into is areas that we can collect the data and build models that recommend improvements to outcomes that both corporations and communities can do. And that's great. And we'll write an article on that. And the publicist did ask a good question. It's like, cynically, what's different now than, remember when we talked about ExxonMobil back in 1977, it's concluding that, yes, climate change is caused by companies like us and blah, blah, blah. And now they've come out and acknowledged that. So what's different now as opposed to then? So I had what I thought would be a crispy answer. And Davey, I'll put you on the spot. And Steve, if you want to jump in, like, what's different now over our ability to have the data overcome whatever our ideology is versus back in, let's say, the 70s or 80s, when we're kind of more influenced by lobbyists than we were by the data?
What's different? Oh my gosh. I feel like there's a lot different, and weirdly, it's connected to one of my topics that I brought this morning. I think there has been, and we're actually, in my view, still in the infancy of this. There has been a push towards the democratization of data, at least within organizations. You know, I think it's debatable the extent to which data has been democratized outside of organizations. You could argue that certainly the open source movement, open data movement has pushed a lot of data into the public realm and available and accessible to all kinds of people. But even within organizations, as organizations flatten, you don't see quite the same pyramidal structure that you used to see through the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s. Pyramid structures still exist, but a lot of organizations have started to flatten themselves out, partially in a bid to attract and retain talent. And through these flattened organizations, one of the unintended consequences of it is that they've had to democratize their data, at least internally, so that, for example, if I'm in the sales organization, I want to have access to the stuff from engineering. If I'm in engineering, I want to have access to the stuff in sales. And so that I can start to make better data-informed decisions about how I'm building products or how I'm developing services. So I think what's changed has been this desire for more parts of the business to be involved in all parts of the business. and that has been slowly, really slowly, leading to a kind of democratization of data. Now, we're not seeing, salespeople suddenly say, "Well, I'm gonna run the engineering department," or engineers suddenly saying, "I'm going to run the sales department." But rather, I need to have visibility into all parts of my organization so that I can make better choices. I think that's very, very different today than it was. I mean, honestly, even 10 years ago, let alone 20. But I'd be curious to hear what you guys have to think.
Well, Davey, I love it in the sense like it's almost this is unscripted, but it almost seems like sometimes when we talk is like you're reading a script which leads right back into what I'm going to say, and it's so cool that somehow it works out that way. The thing that I thought builds upon the idea that the information that we need to make a decision on lots of topics is so wildly available right now, so widely available, especially on areas of public interest, like pollution details or like all sorts of social metrics, and of course internally within organizations. Performance metrics beyond P&L, balance sheet, and cash flow, which tend to be, the traditional metrics by which you run business, but all sorts of supporting metrics are now available as data to employees and
Right.
quite frankly to whoever needs access to them. And then I added one additional thing that we didn't cover in your part of the talk, and that's stuff like this thing here. In this case, it's the NVIDIA 3080 graphics card, which now on this computer that I have right in front of me, I can literally do billions of calculations per second and start doing the actual modeling myself. So
Right. Sure.
and now, of course, it's still at the mercy of my competence in being able to create a model that accurately it interacts with the data. But at least I can do it. And then you can do it. And so there's a democratization not only of the data, but the ability to analyze, to process, and then to make predictions out of the data that is literally happening. Like to do those types of, let's say, the climate thing that we were talking about in the 70s would have taken hundreds of people and lots of spreadsheets and graph paper to crunch numbers and to come up with conclusions that at any point there's huge error bars, and you could easily come in and spread FUD all over it and say, well, because of these error bars, then we got to throw the whole thing out. Whereas now, it's like, man, we can analyze the data millions of ways in sub-seconds, which kind of rapidly eliminates fear, uncertainty, and doubt, and only leaves room for just filters of improvement, in my opinion.
Sure.
So,
Sure.
yeah, that's just what I'm getting at is the idea of the only thing that's left is just filters of improvement, or people who want to throw the baby out with the bathwater and say, don't trust science or don't trust data or whatever. And we're not even going to talk about them today. Forget those people. But for a second, let's just talk about the only thing that's left is just kind of the filters. Is like, are we applying a good algorithm or not? And if we are applying a good algorithm, then here's the outcome. And if we're not, then what do we need to change so that we can apply a good algorithm?
Yeah. It's funny because, it reminds me of, something that I feel like through most of my career, and therefore through most of your career, because you and I are roughly on the same timeline. You'd go through jobs and organizations that you'd be in or you'd work with, and one of the sort of ugly truths that you heard people say all the time, that I'm hearing a lot less and less and less, is that, oh, we're really siloed. This is siloed. That's their data. This is my data. You can't touch my data. I've got my little relational database, and this is my stuff, and nobody has access to it. I think that's dead. Or if it's not dead, it's like limping. And that there's now, through decades and decades of us dealing with these silos, it's now such an ugly, dirty word within an organization that I think that it's slowly being, kind of shown the door slowly. Obviously, organizations of all sizes and types continue to have silos, and organizations of all types and sizes have people that want to hang on to their data and manage their data and not share it with others. But I don't think that's the default setting anymore. I think that that's like a bit of a dinosaur. And in fact, the organizations that are succeeding and really pushing the envelope and doing interesting and innovative things, they're done with that approach. It's not about siloing data and siloing people. And in fact, what's really, really cool is that if you think about it, as a, I'm an engineer, and I've got a big data set that's really interesting to lots of people within my organization. It actually increases my value to be a decent custodian of that data, to make sure that the data has good quality and value that can be shared across the company. Your worth and your value as an engineer on that team goes up with the quality and availability of that data, because the rest of the business can use it. So I think, again, I would say this has not been a rapid shift, but I think that that's the direction that things are turning. And it really, like, we're seeing it again and again and again. And it's this kind of democratizing effect where the real subject matter experts associated with the data have a different role and kind of like a different responsibility to make that data available, to make sure that it's of good quality, to get into a little bit of nerd speak for a minute, to make APIs available for accessing that data, and connections and channels for people to have access to that data. It's really, it's kind of an interesting time, and it's anathema to the first 10 or 15 years of my career, for sure. So it's exciting.
Well, it's neat that you go there, and part of my brain where it goes as you describe that, it's consistent with the fact that it, like in our community where you and I grew up in this region, there used to be a big meat packing plant where lots of people worked. There used to be a big brewery where everybody worked, or you worked at a big insurance company where you might have worked, and our grandparents worked there for 40 years, and then you got the watch or whatever, and you retired. And sometime between 1979 and 1990, the whole cultural idea of being a lifer at an organization was just gone. And I think it was initiated by the corporations itself. It's like long-term humans are expensive, humans are ephemeral, and people started designing around shorter careers at organizations, which then the echo of that is the whole idea of there is nobody who owns that document anymore, that transaction, because they're probably gone anyway within a couple of years. So this has to live beyond them. So it to me, it just ran in parallel. There was just kind of a couple of year lag behind the idea that the humans are ephemeral, and then all of a sudden now nobody cares about owning the document anymore because they're just not going to work there that long.
Yeah, I mean, it's wow. Yeah, I think you're onto something, because what you're implying here, I think, is that something kind of awesome has fallen out of something kind of nasty and unpleasant, which is, the way that organizations have historically treated human capital has been terrible. But one of the things that has kind of spilled out the other end of it is actually maybe a good thing, which is this idea that in order for us to carry on and work effectively together, or to work in a distributed way where we're not all walking into a factory floor every morning, we're spread out across the country or around the world, we need to be able to share and collaborate on all these things in an efficient and kind of productive way. And the way to do that is by sharing data and getting rid of silos and all these other things. So interesting, and I think you're onto something there.
Yeah, which quite frankly I just made up. So
even better,
good or bad or in the middle. I feel like it might be a true fact if we peel back the data and experiment with it.
It also proves one of my theories, which is if you and I talk long enough, we're always going to get back to lunch meat and sandwiches and delicious things like that. So if you let us talk long enough, we'll always bring it back to delicious sandwiches.
Yeah, it's our own wonderful version of, I think it's Goodwin's law, which we don't need to talk about, but I like our version
Yeah,
better.
for sure. Yeah,
Well,
very good.
what do you have first, Davey?
Well, so we talked a little bit about my second one, the data democratization stuff. The one thing I've been kind of interested in, it's more just I'm curious to get everyone's thoughts on whether this is a real thing or whether it's just kind of grumblings or at the edge of stuff. But I've been reading a lot lately about what some people are referring to as fin ops, finance ops, but really specifically in the context of managing cloud costs. And specifically, the classic analogy would be, you don't leave every light on. I'm constantly walking around my house turning out lights that my kids have left on, right? So the classic model for IT is always on, always available, because you don't want to have a situation where somebody needs something and therefore they go to hit it or they go to use something and it's not on or it's not available, the lights are off. So when cloud first burst onto the scene and became such a huge thing, and the cloud hype was enormous, and everybody was excited and moved a lot of workloads and jobs up to the cloud, it was, well, sure, we'll just have all these apps running in the cloud all the time. As we've moved on, one of the things that's certainly become true is more and more workloads are up in the cloud, but the costs have started to really increase for a lot of folks as the size of their data increases, and the cost of putting everything up there, and then of course paying for egress, paying for taking stuff out of the cloud. I'm interested in the fact that it's challenging IT departments to think differently about the way they've always done things, which is rather than having everything on all the time and just turning every light on in the house, getting to be better about turning lights off when you're not using them and that kind of thing. And so I'm curious to know whether or not you're seeing in your conversations that you have with, you talk to a lot of different CIOs all the time. Is this something that they're even thinking about? Do they even have the tools to do this well? What are they missing? Is it a real problem, or is it what I'm wondering, which is just a nuisance and a pain right now?
It's a very real thing for some organizations. So I'm going to say for organizations with what I would call a normal amount of information and a normal workload, let's say 5 to 15 terabytes of data and a couple of primary apps that they use, like a CRM solution or something like that, it is, there's all sorts of different levers that you can pull. Is like, is it fast enough in the cloud? Is it as cheap as it could possibly be if we did it on prem? Or that's kind of a neat debate. But I'm going to go to the extreme and go with an organization that I talked to late in December, who found themselves with 2 petabytes of data inside of a cloud vendor. And then the cloud vendor literally came to them and said, guess what? Now that you are so committed to us, we're raising your prices substantially. Yeah. So they're scrambling to try to get off of the cloud vendor. And yay, Shiny Dogs can help with that. And we're quite excited to do so. But at the same time, it is, it's kind of revealing a bit of a hidden truth, is that one of the intentions of cloud from the vendor's perspective was to make it, cheap initially and seem like inexpensive compared to the capital costs of servers and of humans too. Like, you don't have to worry about having as much of a cyber expert or something like that. You can kind of outsource some of that to your cloud vendor or managed service provider as well. And that was fine. But then all of a sudden, when you're committed to it, you're using their APIs and you're kind of locked in. You got so much data in there, it'll be hard to migrate. Then all of a sudden, is that cool for them to come back and say, oh, by the way, your introductory price is over now. Now you got to pay for our real cost to operate this thing for you. It is a bit of a bait and switch. And I didn't even see that coming. No. I kind of figured if the retail price of cloud was just the retail, their cost plus margin. But turns out in a lot of cases, they were selling at a loss. And now that they're trying to make up for that loss, now we're having this crisis.
That last piece is what I really wondered all along. I mean, I shouldn't say wondered, because I think my educated guess on it was that a lot of these were set up at a loss, and maybe that was the ugly secret that everyone knew but nobody talked about. But that these fantastic deals that people were seeing for cloud prices in the early days, and the introductory pricing, and and of course the tiered pricing for this much data costs this much, and that there are these economies of scale. The more data you add, the cheaper it gets. But I really wonder, from the point of view of the cost to the cloud vendor, how much they had been hemorrhaging, just knowing that what they want to get to is a point where people are fully locked in, and it'll be so massively inconvenient for them to walk away that then you can start to charge kind of whatever you want. I don't want to turn this into like, let's beat up on the cloud thing. The cloud is here to stay. The cloud is wonderful. There's nothing wrong with the cloud. I'm just curious about whether or not we're now into a stage with cloud where people are going to start to develop skills, both of their human beings and also the tools and the applications, to equip them to spend better in the cloud, so that they're not kind of throwing good money after bad, or whatever that expression is.
Yeah, well, I mean, this is kind of the beauty of being we're a scale-up software vendor ourselves. So we're the scrappy ones who do things differently and, quite frankly, get better outcomes than you do with going with the big software companies. But we don't have the scale of the big software companies, so we can pick on them. It's like they're in a situation where it's like anybody who's established, who's big, who just really doesn't have any extra room to grow. And it's easy to name them: Microsoft, Google, Amazon, whatever. Like, I'm not going to hurt their feelings to say that they're kind of as big as they're going to get. And they might want to gobble up one of their competitors, but that's just 1 + 1 = 2 then. So, but the reality is they're not up against me as a competitor. They're up against the fact that computers are getting so much faster and cheaper. Like, I gestured at that video card, which has unthinkable computing power, 100 times that of the entire Apollo space program, and I can hold it in one hand. And the problem with most big established organizations, they have a static thing that they need you to buy and keep buying for the next 20 years, until either they die or they buy somebody else who's doing the next thing. But unfortunately for these vendors is that tech keeps on rolling.
Yeah.
Every couple of years, like Moore's Law and everything else, computing power doubles every 18 months, and it just keeps rolling and rolling and rolling. So they don't have this static thing to sell for the next 20 years that they've set up. And it's caught them. It's caught them now within 10 years of, cloud being the mainstream idea. So anyway, short story long is we find ourselves in a situation where I think as a consumer, like if I'm a CIO, I need to identify as like, okay, is the thing that I'm putting into the cloud going to be static for me for the next 10 years? If so, totally belongs there. If it's something that is kind of evolving or emerging tech or whatever, you probably don't want to do it there, because all they have is bait and switch. That's the only move that they have, is bait and switch for something new, because they don't know how to monetize it yet. So they can only try to attract you and then hope that they can figure out a model at some point in the future. So you're quite frankly better off doing any new emerging tech, which might include AI and other things, on-prem, traditional IT, because you may as well experiment and get locked into what you think is a good deal, rather than being kind of, and I don't want to use the word suckered, because that implies that it's nefarious. It's not nefarious. They want to give you a product, but they don't know any better than you the best way to operate it.
Yeah. And I think it's so funny, because I think you're touching on a lot of different pieces of it that, I don't even view it as a situation, as you say, it's not, nobody's nobody had the wool pulled over their eyes, really. I think we all went into it reasonably eyes wide open because there were deals to be had, and there was logic behind some of the fundamental arguments. OpEx versus CapEx. You're getting out of a situation financially where you're not having to have giant server rooms that you have to air condition and dozens of people to make sure that the motherboards aren't fried and all this other stuff. But the sort of wink that we all kind of made to each other was, well, this is still costing somebody a lot of money somewhere. I'm getting a deal right now. But somebody somewhere is replacing that fried motherboard, or because it's still ultimately going to be a computer somewhere, and I think whether it's a question of us all kind of being more open-eyed and honest about it right now, I think that's what's certainly happening. And to be clear, what I'm talking about is cloud storage mainly. I'm not really talking about applications that are SaaS cloud applications. I think that still makes a ton of sense for a lot of stuff. So I want to be careful that I'm not saying it doesn't make any sense to do anything in the cloud. That's not.
Yeah, don't run your own Salesforce or HubSpot.
Yeah,
they're fine in the
100%.
cloud. There's 100 clouds apps, and probably your email's fine up there, and all sorts of things. It's great.
Exactly.
But I mean, storage, processor intensive things, anything that requires an end user to get something quickly.
Yeah.
Like if I'm scrubbing a video, like Steve, you're on the call here. Can you imagine using nothing but cloud storage for your video editing?
Yeah. Steve would struggle with that for sure. Yeah. That's a great example, right? I mean, it makes no sense. And in our world, in information management, doc management, records management, whichever management you want to focus in on, the idea of an active document that has a lot of life, that has a lot of rich media or rich content associated with it, that can't be something that is so slow to connect to or so slow to access that people don't want to use it. I mean, for records, for long-term storage of records and things that nobody really needs to access very often, sure, I'll offload all that stuff to the cloud. There is an insidious kind of sneaky truth to the message that we're telling people about Shiny Docs, and that's just based on our experience of working with all these customers, is that we know that that a lot of data is duplicated. We know that there's a lot of redundant data. We know there's a lot of obsolete and trivial data, or simply data that has no business value. And when we go from customer to customer to customer at Shiny Docs, that number can be pretty big. It can creep well into the 30, 40, 50% of your data that either is redundant, obsolete, or trivial, or has no business value, or it's a duplicate. And when you start to do the math on that, like you said at the start of this, for a kind of a normal operation or a normal company with 10 or 15 terabytes of data, probably no big deal. Whatever, your costs are your costs. You're not going to lose a lot of sleep over it. But when you start getting into the hundreds of terabytes or into the petabytes of data, it starts to become a problem, particularly when your cloud vendor changes their mind and says, well, I remember that price I gave you 2 years ago. I can't keep you at that price anymore. It's just our costs are too much. So I'm fascinated by where this has all gone. I'm as I say, I've been reading a lot about what people are describing as kind of cloud FinOps, because all of a sudden people are evaluating these costs in ways that they didn't in the past. So
and I like this. It's and it actually segues nice into my next topic, and this is about working directly from data without it doesn't, like I say, data doesn't know whether it's conservative or progressive or whatever. It just knows that here's what we've measured. Instead of orthodoxy or idealism, because some people will be triggered by the fact because they did a big cloud project last year and now we're pooping on cloud, sort of. And but that's the orthodoxy or idealism. So what I'm going to advocate for is next time that you have a conversation, lead with the data. And I'll give one quick example. If somebody says to me, well, taxes are too high or whatever, then the next question should be, okay, cool. Well, what do you think the average marginal tax rate should be? And at what level of income? And if you don't know the answer to that, then don't say that taxes are too high. Go find that out. Okay. And then come back, and then we can have a real conversation working directly with data to see how we should tune the data. Because I think we agree that I'm not going to pay for the entire street ahead of me, so I'm going to share those costs with other people. So I agree that at some level of socialism is good, but it's what we can totally debate. Should it be down here or should it be up there? But in the absence of the data, only thing that you have to debate is the orthodoxy or idealism.
Yeah, for sure. Because I think people don't do that enough, and they march. I think I've even been guilty of this myself, but they march right into the politicization of the data rather than the empirical data itself. One of the things that we have to look at we're getting a little macro here, but you have to look at your demographics. Who are the people in your constituency or your region, whether we're talking about municipal taxes, provincial or federal, or state, municipal, state, federal. What's the breakdown of what their actual earnings are? Is your country or is your locality made mainly of, wage earners, or is it made up of pensioners? Because the situation that you find yourself in and what you can do from a tax perspective is also going to be massively impacted by whether or not you have people in your jurisdiction earning money or not earning money, right? Again, not a political thing, just a pure demographic thing. If your population is made up mostly of 65-year-olds, you're going to be in a very different situation from a tax perspective than if your population is made up mainly of 25-year-olds.
Well, and I'll throw in a different thing that nobody likes to talk about, and that's imagine two 25-year-olds living next to each other. And I'll even say the statistics. It's like one 25-year-old has a middle management job, making $100,000 a year, which is great for a 25-year-old. And they're going to pay, depending on where you live, somewhere between 35 to 46% tax in there when you include your provincial taxes and all that on the things that you buy. So they're going to pay a lot of tax, regardless of whether in the United States, Canada, or anywhere else. And then you have another 25-year-old that lives next door to them that inherited $1.5 million from their parents. They invest that wisely, making a 7% return right now. So they're making about $100,000 a year. And they pay a marginal tax rate of 15% to 25%. So tell me the fairness there, because I get it. You want to stimulate the economy by having wealth reinvested in the economy. However, I'm just statically looking at the way these two individuals are making their money. One of them's out surfing all day, making the same amount as the other, paying half the tax. And the other one's working 40 to 60 hours a week, paying twice the tax. And I don't hear that as part of the conversation. No. It sounds way too, that's evil to talk like that. No. So it's just, to me, it's just data. Like, forget the orthodoxy or idealism. The data says this is happening. So is it fair? Is it something that behaviors that we want to reward? Is it behaviors that's in the best interest of society? I posit to you, Davey, Steve.
It is not.
Okay, the quick assessment.
Well, I mean, look, we're talking about insidious thing after insidious thing today, but the insidious thing is the separation of labor and the way labor is taxed versus earnings on an investment, which is perceived as being not a human thing, that it's just this thing that exists in the ether. And so as a human being, of course, you should be making $100,000 a year. You should be taxed at 30, 40, whatever percent. But an investment that you've made, or that, that is disembodied from you somehow, doesn't get taxed in the same way. And the joke of it is, the insidious part of course, is that an investment is attached to a human being or a set of human beings, a family, an individual, that kind of thing. So I mean, look, it's broken in the extreme, because you have people that are absolutely working their tails off, getting obviously taxed, higher. I don't say too high, but higher than somebody who's making the same money through their investments and getting taxed much less on those gains, right? So
Steve?
Well, I actually wanted to throw a question to you gentlemen. I think it was interesting. Jason, you brought up the idea of really do the research yourself, like learn the data. And if you don't know that data, you're not really in a position to kind of ask the questions. So my question for you is, how do you motivate people to do that? I think this might come from my own selfish perspective of being like, cough cough, lazy people who don't necessarily want to do it, and then face almost a snowballing effect of your example of like someone complaining taxes is too high. Maybe someone doesn't want to do that research themselves, and all it takes is seeing one person on TV saying taxes are too high, just spread that idea, and now suddenly you've got a bunch of people who really haven't done the research and really don't know, but they're all saying taxes are too high. What would you guys say is like a good way to motivate people to kind of like do that research, or like, figure out the data?
Yeah, it's cool. And like I say, I wish I had a non-political answer, but unfortunately there's no such thing. Is that it's so if you look at the conservative view would be that's why we elect leaders, is so that they can lead us. They can go hire the people to get the data and make those decisions. And if leaders were uncorruptible, then that would work perfectly. And on the secondary side, the progressive side will say, leaders can't be trusted. So now all of a sudden you need to go based upon the data. You need to get closer to the data, and you need to constantly be doing that. And you count on people like experts in fields in order to come up with the data. And then you need other experts who are contrary to them to validate the data. And I mean, oh God, progressivism sounds so hard.
Sound hard.
So much work. Isn't it just easier to hire somebody who I trust to make the decision for me? And like everything else, the truth lies on a spectrum somewhere in the middle, where you need to have evidence-based content with contrary people trying to refute the evidence to provide that information, and then leaders that take that evidence and take actions based upon your best interest. And I don't know that that's the system that we have, but I know that if it worked that way, it would probably be good. I don't know if that answers your question, Steve, but that's the first place that my brain went.
No, I think it's good. And I mean, like, I think that's we could probably do a whole episode on the politicization of data and, like the concepts, the conservative outlook versus the progressive outlook there, right? And I think that, even from real world examples of like, things like the economy, right, where people argue the economy is doing badly, whereas by all trackable metrics, it's like doing really well, right? So yeah, I think we could have a much larger conversation about that. So I'll let you guys get back to it.
Well, you actually hit the right thing, is that so the economy, if you measure it just based upon corporate growth, then great. The economy's kicking ass. Yay, people are employed and corporations are growing. However, if you measure it based upon the average human's ability to afford the things that they need, the average human's ability to accumulate wealth and retire, those things are eroding. And that unambiguously, we can go back to the data to show that that's actually true. And so what I would like to see, and it kind of comes, oddly enough, these things always circle back. Remember the P&L, the balance sheet, and the cash flow that corporations are always measured upon. It turns out there's more stuff that we need to measure if we want to talk about performance that benefits us. So, and I think that's the answer to the question, is if we're purely talking about P&L, balance sheet, cash flow, and all that kind of stuff, then great. Corporations are doing fine, which means they're employing people, and that's great. But society is made of real people. I've never met a corporation before, never high-fived them. They've never scored on me in a hockey game. Like, it's, you know what I mean? It's like there's people out there, and some are doing great and some are not. And I don't know that those things are reflected in the scorecard that we talk about the economy doing great.
Yeah, man, I love this conversation. This is a bigger. It's tough that we're running into this one at the end of the call, because I think this is this is a huge topic. I think there's I'm going to bring it back to something that's kind of near and dear to me because of my family. Both my folks were teachers, and one of the things that I think is at the core of the problem is just the way in which the whole system has been set up for us to not understand this stuff. That from early on, from childhood, we're kind of taught that we operate within this immovable system that has been in place for hundreds of years, and therefore it can never change. And as a result of this system, you elect people and they make decisions on your behalf because it's a democracy and we trust this system to be the right way to do things. And everybody kind of nods their heads the whole way and goes, yeah, that sounds good. It does sound pretty good. And I remember feeling that way all through public school and into high school and that kind of thing. But then you start running into some of the things that you talked about, Jason, where you're like, well, can we trust these people to make good decisions for us? And well, if they do a lousy job of it, we'll get rid of them in 4 years. And the next group, they'll figure it out. That's what's going to happen. Of course, what's kind of become true is that nobody really does a great job of it. And, from party to party, or even regime to regime, nobody fully solves a problem. And in the middle of all that, you have a populace that feels like they don't have the time or even the tools to educate themselves in how this is all done. We've all sort of abdicated our responsibility for understanding this stuff, and what we're left with is a gut feeling. It's like, I have a gut feeling that the economy is terrible because bread is $14 or a dozen eggs is $30, so that seems bad. But you're telling me that the economy is great because all these corporations are doing well and joblessness is great, et cetera. So I think that's where the disconnect comes in. And worse than that, we're all kind of ill-equipped to educate ourselves on what can be done about it or what indeed should be done about it. So yeah, not a happy way to wrap up my thought on it, but I think that's still where we are. It feels like that's where we are.
Yeah, and I hope by any stretch nobody listening to this or whatever gets too fixated on like one political ideology or another. I'm not trying to sell anything here. What I'm saying is that I will try to end on a bright note of that we actually have access to this data now. And gesturing back to the video card that I showed before and the advanced processors that are available to everybody, we all have the ability to analyze the data right now. And I feel like our ability to hold ourselves, our community, our leaders, whatever, accountable has never been in the history of mankind in a better position to be data driven.
Right.
So now I think the choice is, do we choose to be data driven, or do we choose to be orthodoxly or idealism driven? For me, as an ADHD kid, I'm only data driven because I can't find myself attaching to any ideology or any leader or whatever. It doesn't appeal to me. It's just I like going back to the data and doing spreadsheets and seeing where the data leads me. And I get that that's not for everybody, but I think the solution is in there. And it's easier to achieve than ever before.
That is exactly it. And I love the way you said, kind of that we've never really been in this situation before where the data is available to us generally to make really, really good decisions as a team. Independent of ideology, independent of anything else. Will we choose to do that? I hope so. I hope that's because I think you and I are the same in that regard, Jason. We want, data to be at the heart of decision making. It's not to say that it's the only thing, but if you're bringing the data that exists and is irrefutable from a scientific perspective, then the quality of the choices that an organization or indeed a nation makes can be that much better. So, yeah.
That is a super positive place to wrap it up. So thanks,
Yeah,
Davey.
no, thank you guys.
Thanks.
That was great. That was fun.
Enterprise Intelligence is a Shiny Docs podcast with Jason Cassidy and Davey Slimmon, produced by Stephen Shunks. Copyright 2024. If you would like to learn more about how Shiny Docs can make it easy to organize your content, protect your data, and make your users happy, visit shinydocs.com today.